Okay. Welcome to Austin Elixir we're in May, right? Yeah, May 2018. Our topic for tonight is context inside and outside of Phoenix. The reason we're covering this is because contexts are not just a Phoenix thing. Like, Phoenix did not create the idea of context. The community read other books, and they're like, hey, this is a good idea. We probably should use that. But it is new for a bunch of us web developers to think in terms of context. That may be because you're not used to using the terminology context, but it turns out you probably had to do it in other languages that have more strict privacy controls or guide you better for your design thinking. Keith, you want to open since you had more prepared remarks, or?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Just sit right here. I don't want to be on camera.
Oh, okay, fine, fine. I will be on camera.
I'll be the disembodied voice.
Yeah.
You're welcome too. Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that, like, so context at a basic level are just a kind of a code organization tool, right? Like that's, kind of a minimum bar for success. For that concept of contexts. But when you leverage them right, they can be, kind of a knife that slices your application into easily maintainable buckets of functionality. I've used this pattern for years now in, Ruby apps and JavaScript and Elixir now, smattering of other languages. And, it's more than anything else is a way of thinking about your application and appreciating where the boundary needs to lie. And then what are the interfaces between different boundaries? So what are the pieces that you can use? And I think what I'd like to see us cover by the end of the talk tonight or this roundtable is what are the different moving pieces that we can use to best leverage this notion of context in a Phoenix application or any other application for
that? So Keith made a good point of saying interface is that you really should think about as an interface, but not in the sense of like a Java interface of I implement this, but more like there is going to be a module at the very tip of your namespace, usually that is the namespace for the context, that every other context is only allowed to go through that entry point. And this makes sure that you have the vertical slice, but your other vertical slices aren't allowed to quantum tunnel between them, because if you do that, you're going to start coupling the implementation details of each context together, and it's going to defeat the whole purpose of why contexts are useful. So you're going to want to, that's why the most code, like Elixir standard library exists because the early standard library wasn't very specific about making sure that each module, the subject type you're talking about was the first argument. So from that, you can kind of generalize that every module should have one type. But then you look at the context that Phoenix generates, and you're like, this is mixing all my types together. Why would I want that? Well, it's because that's the one time where it makes sense to mix your types is at that boundary where you have a context, because that vertical slice then hides the functionality of how the pieces are related. And it also means that you can have public functions that are only meant to be called internally inside that context. So in a language with more than just private functionality, this would be the case of you might have protected or internal, where like you would have permissions that scope it to the namespace. And so that would be much easier to enforce, but we don't have that in Elixir. So it's mostly when you develop your code, to just have that habit of, I don't cross the context boundaries. The guide covers how to think of your context. You can start with one, and if you're not sure, you do a context for every single resource. Now, it's usually very unrealistic that this makes sense, but like the guide says, if you can't think of anything else, do it that way. If you want to see an approach where like every resource is a separate context, the calculator library made when they first talked about Phoenix context does this, where we move the repo calls, or however you get the data sources, into a separate module. Everything calls into that module, like the controllers or the RPC layer, and then everything else has to go through that way, so that you can never know like whether the data is coming from a repo, whether it's coming from multiple repos, whether you're getting it through some weird convention, you know, ETS or Kinesis. Like that context should hide that data representation. Anything else?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess when I look at you know, context, the main thing I'm thinking of is not so much like what's the cardinal schema of this context. I think that's probably one way that the Phoenix guides go a little sideways is to focus on the data as the principal artifact of a context. You know, and certainly the data is important. And to your point, you know, context serves as not just an interface boundary, but an encapsulation boundary. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to go tickling the inside of another context. It's kind of like keep your hands to yourself.
Yeah, I keep that kind of as a mechanistic way of like, can I put a function down in one of the modules underneath the namespace, like a schema module in the case of Ecto, or does it need to be on the context? Am I calling it from another place? If so, it needs to be on the context. Now, you're free to immediately delegate to the other place, and sometimes you should do that because always your context module is going to get huge. But huge modules aren't as big of a deal in Elixir as like huge classes are necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, a module is not a direct correspondence to a class. So like the size of the module is not as important as, I mean, so in object-oriented development, we talk about you want to have low coupling and high cohesion, and the same principle applies within a bounded context. You want to make sure that all of the concepts in a bounded context stand alone and have low degrees of coupling with other things outside of that context. But the part we talk about less often is the cohesion, so that these concepts within it don't overlap over much, but they are all related, right? And so they kind of cover the surface area of this idea of whatever is at the core of the context. Trying to think what else I wanted to say when you were talking, but it'll come back to me.
Cool. I would say one thing to think about in the ecosystem of Elixir is we have this way of doing vertical slices. We have OTP applications. So the question, of course, is why do we have context if we have OTP applications? And I think one of the reasons for it is it's an in-between step of another way of doing vertical slices. So you're just, everything is think vertical slices of related functionality. So you can either have subspaces, namespaces, like the namespaces should be like, these things make sense together. I would almost say that the whole web framework way of like grouping controllers together really, really does not help you think of these vertical slices, because that is totally a horizontal slice of all the controllers go together. That never made sense to me. I kind of like the Trailblazer system in Rails that unfortunately hasn't gotten a lot of traction for that reason, because it's much more like, here's the vertical slice, including the interface. Phoenix is more like, it is one of the outermost interfaces, so like it's okay to group that layer together, but it's still iffy in my mind. But with the context, the guide makes this point is like, you're allowed to do things that you would never do in an OTP app as just, I guess, a general like thing to allow is like, you're allowed to have foreign keys and associations that cross the boundary. But, and it's not called out specifically, I may do a PR for this, is that if you look at the thing where the CMS, where they have a CMS and you have authors and they have to have users, it's unidirectional because you want to always maintain that data dependency the same way you would have dependency as in OTP applications or dependency on system level packages. you need the dependencies to point one way. As soon as you get a circular dependency, you no longer have independent contexts.
See, this is actually a point I disagree with the guys about.
You don't think the data boundary should be crossed?
No, I don't think the data boundary should be crossed.
I don't either, but so the problem with that is I don't see how you don't just end up with one monolithic context then.
Because you don't actually need all of the data from context A and context B. What you need is a referential point, right?
So do you think you'd have a CMS user and a normal user, and you would just duplicate the schema instead?
So why do you need to have a CMS? We'll call it an account, since we're talking about on one hand a login versus a user profile, for example. Why do you need to have those? Well,
in their example, the user is a way of like grouping all ways that one person, one human can log in. So it's a way of like doing email password and Google login and Facebook login all together.
Sure.
And so when you get to the CMS system, you want that login system to still work across all your other contexts, as they're saying, and they don't want to duplicate that.
Yeah, see, I kind of disagree with that. Like, I think that we have other ways of organizing data, like on the authentication side. I think that's a really strong design, right? To have kind of an account that has different login methods tied off to it, right? And that all lives inside of an authentication boundary, okay? But on the authorship side, for example, why do you need to have the account information tied to a blog article, right? My argument is you don't. And having gone through this design process with a number of teams in the last couple of years, there's usually some initial resistance to this idea that you don't actually need to have this data in another context. So, and when we tease through the design a little bit more, we find that, yeah, actually you don't need to have it there.
That is true. Like, you don't care how you logged in the CMS context, so why are you keeping track of it? They do say as a potential option is the fields you do actually care about, you would put in the, I think they call it the CMS account. Is that what the way you're proposing, where like you duplicate some of the fields in the struct, but it's not, like, do you pull them out? Like, in the database layer, do you keep them completely separate tables and you duplicate? Like, how are you represented at the low level in the tables then?
You don't need to duplicate it, right? So here's the thing. And
you're not live streaming tonight?
What?
Are you guys gonna live streaming tonight?
We have a Zoom already started, so that's gonna get recorded. So we don't need live streaming.
Okay, awesome.
We'll do a director's cut of this later on. Yeah, you know, so like stepping back for a second, right? Like, what's the need to have authorship on or the user record duplicated in, say, a blog article context? Why do you need to have that there?
I think it's mostly because when you're logged in, then you can mess with it because it knows you're the author.
I mean,
like,
if only there was a way to write a method that was like, oh, I don't know, like blog articles by owner ID, right? And so when you create the blog article, you supply a token that is the ownership ID, right? And so then it's all.
So you think not a direct foreign key, or do you just mean like in the code you're making it opaque? Like, are you still allowing the foreign key constraint in the database, I guess? Like, I want a very mechanistic, like, how are you keeping them separate?
I mean, so yeah, your database concern is it operates at a different layer.
So,
right.
So you're allowing those to pass, but you wouldn't have the association the way that
I would definitely not put an association on the schemas.
Okay, so you would have a foreign key potentially that is the user ID, and you would enforce that in the migration.
It's not really, so at an application level, it's not what I would call a foreign key. It's more like a correlation identifier. Right?
Okay.
So it's something that allows me to, you know, tag some concept in another BC with information I'll use to later filter and retrieve. So
which context owns the lookup then? Does the CMS in just one function allow to know that represents a real user, or is it the account's context, the user's account's context,
right,
that is allowed to do that correlation?
Something that gets kind of glossed over is this notion of layered architecture, which, you know, stepping back a second, the notion of context in Phoenix is not supposed to be directly from domain-driven design principles.
Right.
But the roots of it are there, right? And so the problem with taking kind of like DDD light of this is that you start missing out on some of the other concepts from those architectures. And one of those is layered architecture, right? And so you have your application layer operating at a very high level.
Mm-hmm.
That coordinates between different domain services. The next level down, you've got domain services. Next level down under that, you've got things like persistence, right?
Okay.
And so your database stuff, and that may be Postgres, it may be Mongo for a different context. It may be LDAP store for your authentication, right?
But even though you're decomposing, they're not independent trees. The database layer, because it's persistent, if they share the same database, they're allowed to like cross the higher levels. Potentially, like you're allowed to have a forward key constraint when the token represents it, or you just leave it off. Because it seems safer to have the database enforce that if it's there.
You can do that, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to
Okay.
it. I've done it both ways, and when I do that, though, it's a persistence layer issue, not a domain service issue, and it's not something that I use two schemas to coordinate.
So if the domain service calls the persistence layer, is there like a separate persistence layer for each domain service, or can the persistence, is it really a layer across all the domain services, and so that allows it to cross?
I mean, laziness being one of the cardinal virtues of a good programmer, I usually reuse my repo module, but you can certainly make a strong case for having separated repos for each, kind of context.
Mm-hmm.
And having those go to different databases, different schemas within the same Postgres database, or different data stores altogether. I've done contexts where I'll use Mobius to look up data for reporting because
what's Mobius?
It's a database. Like it's more like trying to remember the gem from Ruby, but you can give it direct SQL. And run that and get hashes back, basically. But I use that in like a reporting layer because I can run crazy joins across multiple tables that technically break the rules.
Yeah.
Because reporting is always a weird concept.
Yeah, I would emphasize that too. Same thing, like at CST, we did the same thing where like we had separate databases, and because Postgres allows you to attach to multiple databases at once, we were doing cross database joins in our reporting layer, just because when you get to the money layer, they kind of don't care about your random design. They want the reports they want.
And I was having this conversation today with a client about this exact kind of set of concepts around reporting, and like what are the rules you can break, and how can you go about that, right? And reporting seems to always be that cross-cutting concern that everybody likes, that seems to need to break out of any one context. And there's a number of ways you can approach that, and we can talk about those if that's interesting to people. But the main thing around those kind of cross-cutting contexts is that you allow yourself a little bit more latitude. If everything's stored in Postgres, like write a database view that gets reflected in a schema that points at the view, not at individual tables. Doesn't need an association to other contexts or anything like that. It's something you can look up, by customer ID or something like that, right? And I really feel like GraphQL is kind of a game changer for this kind of design principle, because it gives you a really, really easy place at the edge of your system, at the boundary, to tie together contexts which are thoroughly decoupled, right? And you can do that using like batch resolvers. You can do that in a way that's very efficient, and still lets you present kind of a unified interface to your clients or to outside systems. And we were going to talk through a scenario today where we would use GraphQL internally in order to preserve that kind of like unified interface, even though the data was coming out of several different contexts for the report.
Like in one beam, or like between microservices, so you really are doing GraphQL over the wire?
Within a single node, but you
Okay.
could do it either way. I mean, the notion we were talking about was just using absence.run
Oh, okay.
to run the input, put a convenience interface around it, but ultimately that would be kind of the process there. But you could also easily tie it to, an HTTP interface and go through the wire to do that, go over the network.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that using absence directly, if you were going to do something like that, is really the better way to go.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of a corner case. Like, I wouldn't recommend you start out of the gate doing that.
No.
My general recommendation for this stuff is do the right thing first,
Mm-hmm.
which would be use the public interface. And, as you dig into, I don't like to talk about kind of generalities with this stuff, especially reporting, because
I mean,
it's a one size fits all solution.
I think it's important that we cover like specifics and details, because if we want generalities, the guides would have been enough, and we wouldn't have this as a topic. So obviously the general guide of the example of a blog post is not cutting it. So like these examples are helpful, I think.
Yeah, and I think that like a blog is simply not a complex enough vehicle for talking about these things,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like I've got a friend who is eternally expressing frustration with this notion of context, because it's really kind of like this fuzzy, squishy thing that nobody seems to have a super good handle on yet, or a lot of people don't feel like they have a good handle on yet. And so they end up creating a lot of boilerplate stuff because they don't really understand how to use the tool yet,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's hard because there's a lot of like conflicting information going around. And so for things that are simple, applications, my advice is generally like skip the context. Like you're not forced to create them. These are just generators that you can use.
Yeah.
I think they're good tools to have.
I think it might only be worth it, the generated ones of, like it says, so you think about it. But the other one would be that, so when you drop into IEX, like you have things that are a little bit easier than like doing all your imports and aliases to get all your repo stuff set up, which is a lot of boilerplate to sit in your .IEX or to paste every time you have to go in the shell and, mess around it. When you're doing that like pre-production dev where you're messing with the database, you're like, oh, this wasn't a good plan. What if I change it? Or what if I do stuff by hand in dev because I don't have factors available, or I want to do fake data without going through the forms yet.
Right.
And it can help there as a tool. Like that was always my argument for using stuff like Calculator, even if you don't have like JSON RPC and normal web APIs, you still have that extra use case of you yourself in IEX, make your life easier, have nice wrappers around stuff, which is what the functions in the context really are, is nice wrappers around stuff.
Yeah.
And then there's also the principle of stop diving down and knowing your implementation details, even if they're defs and not def Ps, just because we don't have protected in the sense of like a namespace protected.
Right.
So we just have to enforce this ourselves, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think that part of that is code discipline, right? Like a lot of this stuff, you can get in any language, and I've done it. It's not that it's antithetical to Rails. Right?
Oh no, there was actually on one of the, I think it's one of the podcast. The what's the big Rails app that's like it's Shopify. Shopify is writing this tool where they can make sure they don't violate context by actually tracking when like they call code in another context.
I mean, that seems like a whole lot of effort, but if you got a big enough team and
I think it's such an old code base that they want to make sure that they maintain discipline, because I think it's such a big app now.
Yeah, I think it might be a useful linting tool. I think that ultimately education is your better bet there, and a strong code review process and things like that. And barring that, like actually putting things into Rails engines or a microservice or something like that, so that you have a limited scope that you're actually able to talk to.
Yeah, I don't remember if it was like this intermediary step of like, because it already happened to us. So our current client is open source, so I can talk about it. So we're POA networks. They're a variant of Ethereum where instead of doing proof of work, they do proof of authority, which is just like people that are agreed our authorities can mine, but without having to, waste electricity.
Sure.
But in that, we already have the context of the whole chain, and we have the context of like how to get like talk to the nodes, because the nodes have JSON RPC interfaces. And so like at first that was just a context, but like it became an OTP app as we built up stuff, and that's the intermediate step of like eventually we will make this a library. So like context can just be a good way of like I don't want to clear the application specific cruft out of this potentially to make it an OTP app, or once you get OTP app, you're like, I don't want to make this configurable enough for my use case, but also as a library. So like it's a way of thinking of in between stuff. But all those, like I said, are vertical slice to enforce code discipline of don't be hopping between your low level areas, because you're going to get overly coupled and you're going to break shit very easily.
I mean, that's the number one reason I say, I mean, among several, but don't put associations to outside context on your schemas, right? Don't duplicate data. You can duplicate data. It's okay to do that if you need to, but really take a good hard look and figure out, do I actually need to do this?
Yep. Or
is there a better way of doing this stuff, right? And, I think that most of the time you'll find that if we really take a good hard look at our proposed context, that there's a way to do it without coupling these things together, deeply. I think that the more people get used to how to think about this stuff and how to like appreciate where the boundaries are, the more this is a skill that translates to other code they may write, no matter where it is. I mean, I've described it as using like, this is a refactoring technique for, I've done a lot of work on, rescue projects and things that needed like heavy refactoring just to be able to add a new feature to it. And, the best way to go about it in my book is I used to use command, objects and Rails to do this, and factor them into shoeboxes. And I would get like just a bunch of, start with taking a hairy controller method and just transplanting it into a command object that basically took the params in and did the exact same thing and sent the result out.
Which is pretty much what all the context functions do that are made by the generator.
Right. And so, as you do this, you can start teasing apart the different concerns that, all right, well, this context is our pricing data. How does that, relate to, a user profile, which is used in here for some reason, right? So you can start teasing those out and then, write additional, command objects or methods that get delegated to by the first one you did. And eventually you end up with a bunch of shoeboxes of this stuff. And once you've done this enough in a really hairy app, you start appreciating like on the front end, like, all right, when I'm writing this, what's the actual boundary I need to be looking for, right? And so Phoenix is not any different. Hopefully, I'm sure that we do have plenty of like legacy applications already out there that need to be.
I mean, someone from Elixir Comp EU like had the whole thing of like, we were converted to Phoenix and then like context get announced. Now we're legacy. So like, yes, people feel legacy in Phoenix already.
I mean, I think I've got a project that I've maintained for 4+ years that turned into legacy code right under my nose. Yeah. Right? Like, I wrote it as a greenfield app, but it still turns into legacy code, right? And that's fine. Like, that's just what code does, right?
Yeah.
The frameworks move on and you don't update everything, and eventually you're a couple steps behind as painting has to get it up to date. Yeah. That's just the way it goes. I think that contexts allow us to kind of shoebox that pain into different parts of our application. So, if there's something that, needs to be independent, we can at least put a big bright line around that, this crazy hairy mess that we don't really want to think about too much, and it doesn't have to affect the other parts of the application. Yeah. We should probably ask if there's any questions at this point. Is anybody online besides Nola?
Yeah, Nola, I think it's just Nola. That's the only one I can see. Nola, do you have any questions?
Still don't understand. I got a copy of the new book, Phoenix book, for review.
I haven't read the edition with context, so I can't make specific comments about the version that has context mentioned in it. But if you want to review it, that would be helpful.
So it's like it's just a fancy name for way you group code.
Yeah, I mean, that's all modules are, is a fancy way to group code.
And it kind of bugs me that it's, okay, I have this thing. So if I'm looking at my code, I'm working with test cases. So my module is called test case. And my comment is, this is the freaking context. Like, I would expect you to call it something context. Put context in the name of the file so that you look at the file, you go, oh, right there. There's my context thing. And
I mean, the suffix is very much like a Java naming convention. And like,
this is weird.
For the controllers too. So I would actually say, no, I wouldn't expect that, but mostly because I hate that convention of like putting the type in the name for the modules.
Yeah, I think in general, pattern name should not end up in your, especially if you're dealing with like domain-related concepts. Like the idea is that it's used in language. So,
I mean, if you don't have a context that groups multiple resources, you can just end up where the context is the plural form of the schema module, which isn't. And like that's what I did in Calcinator before the guide was written about how they meant context to be used. Like that's what I did. And it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but it's a way to think about it. And it's just mostly for like that low-level single resource. For me, it's just a way of like hiding whether I'm using a repo or a remote data source. And it's because we have the general rule that Ecto schema modules should not know about repo, except in the case where you get past the repo. Like, because they're supposed to be pure functions. And so you need this module to touch your persistence layer, and that's the context module, the way the generators make them. Now, there's other reasons to have context modules like we've talked about, but that's like the base one for just CRUD apps of like, it's where you put your persistence layer access, like from a very mechanistic way of like what the generator is doing. And it's also the way of grouping your interface together so that you don't, from the controller, dive into the individual schema modules or helper modules for those schema modules, which happen when you actually have business logic of you probably won't have them all just be hanging off of change set.
Yeah, I think I follow with you. And my, again, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, Ola, but I think that one takeaway should be that, like, if you haven't sussed out a concrete module yet or a set of concepts yet that create a boundary for yourself, don't go creating a context for it. Like, you don't have to use the generators to create new code.
So I think it's still worth separating out the repo calls. So you keep your, I wouldn't, so like if your option is I'm going to put all the repo calls in the controller or like put them in the schema, I don't think either of those are a good choice. So like I still want a module that is context, like even if it's not like from the design perspective, but just like I hide the persistence layer of how I'm getting the data. Because like Ecto is so useful as a validation and params, like a casting framework without the repo part.
Yep.
And yes, we always mentioned like it'd be really great if it was 3 libraries, but it's not. So the parts that aren't the persistence layer, we want to keep separate from the parts that's their persistence layer because it separates the purity from the impure parts of touching the database. And so that's, you can think of like just from a mechanistic like way of like, this is what goes in the context module, even if you're not doing it for any other reason. That would be one reason to have them. Yeah, the naming, I go with plural if you can't think of a better name. But like the guides emphasize, hopefully in your domain, there's some name that makes sense. So like for ours, like each individual schema was an individual like resource on the chain, like a block or a transaction. But then like the context is called the chain because it's a blockchain. So like hopefully there's a domain name that makes sense. And we only have that one context module for all the schema because like that's the one that's the level like how to read from the database. And then we have also how to import, but we have a separate thing for indexing the chain when we're talking over JSON RPC. And we have a separate OTP app for the actual like HTTP level. So that got moved out of not being callbacks anymore in our example.
Okay, my other question is so right now I followed the book and I made a context that has a method function, I would get called list test cases, which returns an array, a list of my database like data structures.
Mm-hmm.
So that I could use it following the book that, oh, you do this to just to get started before you don't need the database at this point, just make your dummy data here. And then, so I use this function, list test cases, in my controller to get my initial thing set up. Okay. And then do I replace the function in my context with the real repo to the database call, or
the internals of that function would get replaced with repo all, which if you use the generators or the guide, it just shows you that code. So yeah, the book is a teaching resource, so it shows you that like this is why we want to do this thing, but you have experience. You could just jump straight to the generator and then start editing the code. Like you can read the book for like why we do it, but you don't have to do that like in between we completely mock the code thing. If you know you're going to use a repo, just go do it. It'll be fine. Like, yes, there is the whole emphasis of do you actually need a database for this? Because maybe you can get away with it with in-memory gen servers or ETS, because those are available to us with Elixir. But if you know you're going to put in Postgres, just go with it and use the generator if you can't remember. List wants to use repo all. They don't really cover it, but like in our case, I added an option to pass in pagination information. Now, I didn't call them left or right join, of course. I called like whether they were required or optional associations, because we have very different performance characteristics. So like the guide is like, we're always going to preload everything for you. And like, that's not good performance for us. So like we allow the controller to pass that in. But otherwise list is just list. But for us, it's more complicated. And it's, a Scrivener page thing, because it didn't make sense for me to make an object that hides that we're using Scrivener. And also Scrivener is not Ecto specific. It can work on anything. So I felt okay with that. There's also the caveat of like, Ecto change set is such a useful way to group validation errors that making up your own one just to hide the fact that you're using Ecto doesn't really make sense. And that falls back to the whole, there's 3 parts to Ecto, and the validation system is very nice even if you're not using the repo part. And that was the case at CC where I use Ecto to parse the incoming JSON RPC because it was a nice way to convert from JSON types to Elixir native types. And so I still use it even though it wasn't backed by a repo source. I wasn't crazy enough to do like the GitHub API in an Ecto repo thing, which I was tempted to, but I'm like, no, don't go crazy. So, I didn't read the book, so I can't be like how much you need to follow to keep following the rest of the book. But in general, yeah, you're going to replace the internals of repo. And just from a pure, like the type of code that goes in the context, just think it's your call to your persistence layer, whatever that may be. And it is your controllers and any other interface like command line, mix tasks, or an IEX, you should be calling functions directly on the context module and not diving internally to call like a change set function or any other helper functions. You can delegate in the context, but you never want to call directly because you want to be allowed to just get rid of those if it turns out that you don't need a change set function because like you always throw it over the wall over JSON RPC or Kinesis to something and you never need a change set. You don't want anything else to know you did that. So you want that context you don't want your controllers to know that. You don't want anything else to know. And so like you want everything exposed on that context. And if it starts to get you noisy and you're like, well, these things can be broken up, that's when you spawn a new context. if you're like, how do I get more than one? That would be a reason why. If you can start to see that there's a seam and it doesn't make sense that they're together anymore. Like you could hide the fact potentially that the schemas are related, but like he said, you probably don't want to mix them together at the ecto level if you can avoid it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like keeping them separate. And I mean, on the notion of like finding a seam where you didn't see one before, it's really common actually to, as you're fleshing out the concepts within a particular context, where you'll start to realize, all right, well, these 3 or 4 things are always happening at the same time and kind of go together. They're all related. They don't really have any meaning outside of this boundary. They're strictly internal, and nobody else has to know anything about this stuff. Like no other context is dependent on this data. And then these other 3 things that were part of this, we were kind of looking at as part of the same set of responsibilities. Well, it turns out like those actually, they're kind of independent. Like we really just need an identifier to go along with them so we can track which thing it's going with, but there's no reason for us to have to track like this set of status information along with these other deeper information about this thing, right? And so that kind of distinction between those 2 starts to give you a seam where you can say, all right, well, this is, a subcontext, if you will, or a boundary within the context itself, and it's not something that needs to be known outside of the larger boundary.
Yeah. So I was thinking about that as you were talking, that there can be contexts that aren't immediately under the root namespace. So like the same way that like for ours, since we're exploring a chain, it's called Explorer, and we have the chain and we have index, but under there we have separate namespaces and therefore separate contexts for like the different protocols that can be supported. So like each implementation of the clients support slightly different APIs that like they agree on a standard, but unfortunately we care about the parts that are non-standard. And so those subcontexts, like we have multiple modules, but we make sure that everything that calls in at a root level. And the nice thing about that is those subcontexts, I was able to make a behavior then to be like, they all need to support these context functions that are just callbacks. And so I can make sure that when we add if a new client comes on the scene that's important enough that the community says, well, we're running all our nodes with hopefully a client written Elixir, because that's in development, that we'll be able to call it and get the data we need out without having to care how it actually works as the wire protocol.
Right.
And so context is like, you can think of it even more generally, I have a namespace and I can call down, but stuff can't call across the tree.
So that, I think that's a good point to kind of segue into something I wanted to.
Or I should say, it can call in one tree. It can call across branches, but you can't jump between branches in the forest.
Yeah, keep it all in the same tree.
Yeah.
So something worth kind of talking through is, what are the control surfaces that you think about for a context? Right, and like where do you think about using them, and what are the different modalities that you find yourself using when you're trying to either have communication across contexts or coordinate across contexts in some way?
A lot of times I think of the type dependencies, and so like there's certain cases when the Elixir compiler will allow you to get circular dependencies because it doesn't check for efficiency reasons to prevent recompiles. So like the obvious one is like you can associate on both sides. But I'm always thinking in my head of like, which way do the arrows point for the data dependencies? On either the types or like the call structure. And that way, that's why I figure out that I need an interface function, because I'm like, well, if I make, so as an example, we have the indexer, and I have, the indexer depends on the chain context, because it is the context that we can use to read read-only data. But it also then has an import function, and that's because I didn't want the indexer to know the internal representation more than what the other read-only functions were giving us. But that also made the decision that there couldn't be helper functions on the individual schemas of like, this is how I take the raw JSON format that is specific to each client and turn it into the params. Like I couldn't have a specialized change set that handled the weird params format because that context would then be dependent on the indexer one. There'd be no data dependency, but just like semantically, it knows the design of the indexer one. And so there is something that the compiler's not going to enforce, but something as a human I can see of like, there's now this dependency on indexer's internal representation of a map and a nested map. And so that's bad. And so flipping that, the indexer, because it has to already call the explorer chain context functions, it's allowed to know the params format that is going to be accepted by the change set. Because I have to choose a direction, and since the arrow was already pointing that way to be able to do reads, I'm going to make writes go the same way where it can know the format that the writes need so that there's that data dependency. Even if the compiler and the tools aren't going to enforce it, I'm enforcing it with that flow so that the dependency is that way. And that's very important because if I ever pull this out in an OTP app, it will have to work that way or it'll blow up. Or if I turn it into a library, it'll have to work that way or it'll blow up. So when it's a context, I'm enforcing that by hand.
Yeah, so that's a big part of the design. That still feels like a bit of a smell to me, right?
Yeah, it's not great. It's not great.
I think you're missing a layer there.
Right. So there is kind of an in-between layer, but because we didn't need a library yet, it's mostly so we can batch insert so we can do it really fast. So there's that caveat.
Right. And so that's something else we need to get to at some point is the optimizations you make and where do you break the rules, right? Because, you know, you will have those, right? Like my first piece of advice I usually give somebody going down this road is stick to the rules. You know, like here are the guidelines and kind of stick to these as much as possible. And then when you find something that takes 30 seconds that should take 2, like start looking at what you can optimize. Right.
So when Dockyard inherited the project, the previous contractor wasn't doing any batching. And so like it was taking as long as it takes for a client to get the chain from like the network, which is like 6.5 days or some shit like that. And like Chris McCord did a bunch of like batch optimization, proper supervision trees and got it down to like 5.5 hours. And part of that, it's just batching. Like any language, you could just do batching. But the batching does mean that the indexer kind of knows the relationship between stuff but part of it is also enforced by just the JSON RPC API where like, you know, we need a block first to get the list of transactions and we need those hashes to get all this metadata about transactions. So like, it's kind of enforced by how the other API works anyway, but it is leaking that interdependence that in theory only Explorer chain should know about.
Right. Remind me again, what is the indexer's role?
The indexer is getting stuff from the JSON RPC, which is like the actual like node that sits on an Ethereum network that could do mining or just like send like or sign a transaction to be like, I want to make this purchase, you know,
sure.
With
Ethereum node. Yeah.
Right. So that they have a JSON RPC protocol that they all agree with. But unfortunately, the thing to get like part of Ethereum, the whole big thing is like smart contracts, which is just like, you know, it's just software that like does math. But those contracts can do transfers to other addresses. So like a block is a transfer. That's just between 2 addresses. So 2 people in theory. But one of those can be a contract. When you do that, that contract can do as many transfers as it wants. And it can even hold value in itself. Mm-hmm. So that means in order to get the actual everything the contract did, you have to do this API that is not part of the standard. So for parity, which is the Rust client, it's called trace replay transaction. And for Geth, which is the Go one, which has a much cooler name because Mass Effect. Geth is much better. That one is called debug trace transactions. And like they have the same data, but it's a slightly different format, and they haven't agreed on it, even though to actually calculate like where the money went, you need to know this.
So the indexer is doing what now? It's pulling it down from the JSON RPC?
It's seeing everything JSON RPC, so it's replicating the entire chain and putting it into a Postgres database that you can easily jump to a location. And also both of those things involve actually telling, because that's so much data to keep track of that replay, none of the clients keeps track of it. So you're actually telling it to, on the Ethereum VM, replay that transaction because it's deterministic. So at any point you can be like, replay what happened and get the data, and so they don't keep it. But since we want people to be able to walk quickly and like find all the things that happened to their wallet, we store it out. And so like we're just getting the whole chain but represented in a way that's easier for people to view in a web app.
So what I'm hearing is that the indexer is dependent on this JSON, this remote web service.
Right. And so that's an OTP app right now. And then the indexer is, it keeps track of the streaming and like finding holes in the data and like handles the unreliability, because we can DOS the Rust nodes.
Sure.
Which is fun.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta play with rate limiting and all that kind of stuff, which is its own.
So the indexer handles that stuff, so that the Explorer chain, which is more meant for like the read-only and as the context that people can read the data from. But of course, it has access to the change set functions. So we put the import thing that does the batch insert on that context instead of on the indexer, because otherwise the indexer would have to know the internals and call into the change set functions in the chain otherwise.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, it sounds like a fairly complicated set of operations, and there's probably some optimizations that you've done as part of that.
Oh, there's still a bunch we could do, because most of this is, this 5.5 is like the genesis problem of like, I install the app and I want to use it because it's open source. We want people to use it, install it. And so it's mostly like, we want the best startup experience possible. So like we might later on be like, you go peek at your wallet and all of a sudden we see that address and we walk around you as opposed to linearly through the chain, because you probably don't give a shit about stuff that happened 2 years ago. But just as a matter of like, you want to support all of it, we walk the chain from its inception.
Yeah. Well, I think we're getting a little far afield from kind of the set of questions, which is, what are the control surfaces? So one of the things you're talking about now is actual data, right? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the ways that you interact between different bounding contexts.
Yes.
Like the ones, that's what I actually try to stay away from. So, I think we talked about earlier, is, sharing data unless you're in a situation where you're trying to optimize a complicated thing, which sounds like is what you're doing there.
Yeah, I really wish there was a way to pull something out underneath a block, because a lot of stuff is related to like transactions. Like there's a receipt for the transaction. So like a transaction could be pending and the receipt is when it actually gets mined, or the general term is collated into a block. So in theory, there's this whole subcontext of just transactions. And transactions has logs, they have receipts, they have internal transactions. And that could be a subcontext, but the problem is they touch addresses like crazy. And the addresses matter for everything. So like there'd either be a context of like a block is by itself and everything else is below it. And at that point, it's like, well, I'll just keep the chain together. Like I wish I could come up with a better way to break up that something that would make sense. But I haven't thought of a good way to do it yet.
So the ways that I look at kind of coordinating between contexts, one of the first ones I usually reach for is messaging patterns, right? Mm-hmm. One of the best books I can recommend on this subject is called, it's not Patterns of Enterprise Architecture, it's Enterprise Integration Patterns. It's from Addison Wesley, I think, and it's part of one of Mark Fowler's series of books.
Okay.
He's not the author of it, but it is just it sounds really dry, but I guess it is if you're not really into enterprise architectures. But it's basically a big book of messaging patterns, right? And different ways you can use those in contexts and different tools that are at your disposal there, right? And so if you're getting into Elixir and OTP in general, it's one of the best non-Elixir books I can recommend somebody read, because ultimately everything in Beam is about the message.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that when we think about the public interface of a context, part of that is functions that live in a module, an interface module somewhere that you can call, right? That's kind of the push interface where I want to shove something into that VC or tell it to do something, right? There's an inverse of that, which is some messaging pattern like PubSub, right? Or a subscription mechanism where I'm registering as a listener on it. But more often, like I use Phoenix PubSub as the mechanism of choice there. And then you have, so that's once you get something connected to it, you've got now an avenue to send out public events, right? So you've got, if you're doing like event sourcing or something like that, you can have, a lot of private events inside of the context, but then outside the context, we have listeners for the public events. And so if you've got 10 different events that are relevant inside the context and help coordinate and build up the data within that based on user interactions or incoming data from somewhere else or whatever, you might only have one event that's actually part of your public interface where you have to keep that event schema static, and so, with the quantity of data you're talking about, it's probably, you're looking at a messaging storm there if you try to pub sub out that.
Yeah, we will probably have pub sub soon because like part of it is they want people to be able to sit on the web app and get the Phoenix channel messages. So at some layer we're going to have to integrate. When the import happens, either we're going to put a message somewhere and eventually Phoenix channels will hear about it, or directly, like somehow we're going to have to integrate a way to get back up to Phoenix channels that this stuff has happened. Because in theory, if you're sitting on like a pending transaction and we see the block is mine, so like there's the Genesis one, which is just like run through, get me these block numbers in a huge batch. And then there's another one where like you sit and you pull because like there's a standard for the WebSocket, but it's not very reliable, so we can't use it. We will get new blocks, and then like everything that would be pending has to switch over. So like for the real time part where people are sitting there just waiting for like their purchase to actually go through, that will eventually probably need an event system that eventually talks to Phoenix channels so that the web layer can know like, yay, it's purchased. Or technically blockchain, you're not supposed to trust until like how many blocks happen, because in theory the network can fight and be like, nah, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
It's very rare, especially on the POA network, because it's trusted. It's not certified accountants. What is it? The people that can stamp your documents. What is it?
Notaries?
Notaries, yeah. They have to be registered notary publics in the US.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so like block fighting shouldn't happen, but at the same time, like it's the same rules of any blockchain of like at any point, if you control enough the network, you could fight and like rewrite your transaction.
Right. It's a consensus algorithm ultimately.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know. It's probably going to it would end up taking your ingestion time back from 5.5 hours to a few days to go over pub sub that way, or you'd end up with a whole lot of like deep messaging queues.
Right. So probably what we'll do is like detect the pending ones, and I think right now we don't get pending by default. The JSON RPC, you have to ask for pending. So I think right now the current batch ingester would never see pendings anyway, so it's not a problem. But we will have to, ask for the pendings, or maybe the real-time sees pendings, and like that path, because it can be different. It's not right now. It just goes through the same like importer, but with like one block or something. So it doesn't need to be batched, but it passes through anyway.
Yeah.
That we will have to like go to a more message passing system so that Phoenix channels knows without Explore Chain having to be dependent on Phoenix, because that's the whole point of why we separate them as separate OTP apps, is like we have that nice web layer that is completely separate. So Explore Chain has to communicate with the Phoenix channel layer somehow without depending on Phoenix channels. So we'll need some sort of messaging system that isn't Phoenix channels, isn't like Phoenix channel broadcast or whatever, send broadcast, whatever. It's not calling directly in the chain to do that.
Well, there's a lot of options you can use based on what your requirements are. I mean, does it need to be durable? Does it, need to be guaranteed?
Oh, it doesn't need to be durable, and like we probably wouldn't go heavy on like depending on an AWS system. It'd probably be just some Gen server, like Gen event or whatever, because like yes, we're dependent on Postgres, and yes, to get the 5 hours you need, a good server, we recommend AWS deployment, but we don't want to make it overly onerous for people to set up their own because we want adoption. So we will probably do, internal single node messaging, or Phoenix pub sub, but hide it. So not in the Phoenix sense, but more in the pub sub sense of like, if we want to support multi-node, we would use it.
I mean, stepping back away from that particular set of problems though, like from, to what I think is more generally applicable. I mean, the answer I usually give people in this sphere is always it depends, right? Like there's never a concrete answer that I'm going to tell you is one size fits all. And there's there's trade-offs for everything. I mean, like, if you use some Phoenix pub sub, well, those aren't durable messages. If the node goes down, the mailbox goes down.
Right.
Right. And so I can switch off to AMQP or, Kafka or something like that.
Yeah.
But they're all kind of like options within that sphere,
Yeah, in the general sense of our case, it's more like a signaling mechanism that, hey, you don't have to refresh the page, we'll just tell you. And so it's not important for durability. But if the messages, if like the data did not get into the database unless it went through the messaging system, yes, it would have to be durable, of course. Because otherwise we didn't really index the chain until it's in the database, because that's if it just had to exist on the network, it already exists on the network. That's not
right.
Like our source of truth is whatever the network says that it is. When you ask an actual node, we're just having the database is a very nice cache so that you can jump to anywhere on the chain, which you can't do
right.
with the way the nodes run by default, because it's too expensive to run them that way and have them, actually do their normal cryptocurrency stuff.
Right. So anybody got any questions or thoughts you guys want to contribute or talk about or ask about?
Yeah, we're only an hour in, so we got 50 more minutes.
Nothing really coming to mind.
Okay.
We kind of came in a little late on where things started out. Very specific.
We're talking about Phoenix contexts and how they're not actually Phoenix specific.
Yeah, it's more of a kind of looking at the design aspects of context, what makes a good context, what are the choices that confront you whenever you start building these interfaces.
I guess if you compare and contrast some of it with something else, like why not just use module? Just devil's advocate. What the difference between module and context?
They are a module.
Yeah, there's no. This is the point I was making earlier, is that like the context or something that particular structure of things is given to you by the Phoenix generators, but if you've got a really simple app, like there's nothing that prevents you from just using a module and doing everything right under the root namespace. Like it's I think I've been using them in all of my code for years now, and by other names, but it's ultimately it's a matter of kind of like boxing out different concerns within your application and making sure that you've got kind of domain specific code grouped together in a way that keeps it clean and decoupled from the rest of your application. Okay. So yeah, there's not much difference.
Kind of Phoenix specific, like.
Well, I mean, the concept originally came out of some reading in the domain-driven design world,
right?
Which is bigger in Microsoft land, but applicable everywhere.
Context.
Yeah, and that's the original, root of the concept, but it's been kind of like walked back into something a little wider these days. And fortunately, when you walk it back a little bit, you drop some of the other things about DDD that actually make them work. So I think I don't practice DDD religiously. I think that it, there's parts you're gonna practice and not practice, once you got a little bit more experience with it. That kind of informs the way I use context in any case. So are you gonna say something?
Yeah, when I first heard about it, was through Chris's talk.
Lone Star a couple years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And his example of showing like orders versus customer inquiries versus some other aspect of business that don't have anything to do with each other. Yes, they're part of the creative business, but they shouldn't. The functionalities and everything else associated with that department, if you will, that specific functionality is unique and shouldn't necessarily be co-located within the same, with other departments. So it's like your architecture, like creating like salons that are meant for everything that deals with the same stuff, and then building B, building C has its own unique concerns. And I guess it's kind of like just how you organize your folder structure, but also the communication channels. Like there's practically only one file, and it's like you see the API to everything that department does. And that's kind of then how you structure the concerns of your application. And it's all subjective and abstract, but that's how I
it's a way of shielding the internals so that you don't. It's mostly just a shorthand of like, I should only call from one context to another through the functions on that context. And the other one, since you missed it, is like the context module is probably your only one where you're going to end up mixing types. Everything else, is usually one type specific. And so we violate it there, but like there's still a chance of like if it gets too busy or too long, you can move the code somewhere else and delegate, like I said at the beginning.
Well, and something I do a lot of times is I'll create a coordination context. So, in a layered architecture, you've got your application layer. Under that, you've got your domain services layer. To that, I'll underneath the domain, you've got like your persistence layer, and maybe Postgres over here, and MySQL on this one, and Mongo on this data store, and this is a remote data service, right? So that kind of persistence thing is underneath, it's kind of controlled, by the context using it. Something else I'll do a lot of times though is create a layer above the application layer, or kind of in between the application and the services layer, that coordinates between two different contexts, right? And so like one of the tools that you use frequently to handle control surfaces that you can use is a process manager whose job is just to listen to things coming out of one context and then decide to forward it on to another, right? And so you've got a coupling there in between things.
Courier.
Say what?
Like a courier.
Yeah.
Between the different departments.
Right. And so, I'll use process managers, which are just implemented as gen servers. And depending on, there's some frameworks that, you can do CQRS and event sourcing with, that kind of thing. They have different roles and those kind of things, but just at a basic functionality layer, right? I've got these things that are gen servers hanging out. His job is to coordinate between, my order system and my warehouse system and make sure I've got supply. And if I don't, then fire off a quick order to my supplier and say, hey, I need a new batch of widgets. Get them over here, right? Instead of sending off an email to the customer and saying, oh, we can't fill your order, right? Or sending emails. Notifications are another good kind of like layer above that. So these coordination contexts, and they don't even have to be a complete context, but just something that sits above two things. And it has a coupling to these other two pieces, but these two pieces don't know about each other or not coupled together. Doing that allows you to keep a cleaner boundary between them and keep things nice and focused within those things, and not, you can do things like reproduce data. There's a pattern, floating around that's been around for a while called an autonomous service or an autonomous bubble that is a thing that kind of like is responsible for replicating its own data, right? That data may come from another context of listening to like the public events of one context and then creating a parallel data store to what's already in the database from the list of the other. He's not allowed to mess with the other guy's stuff. And so, he reproduces it within his own data store. Less efficient. It's a useful pattern though for working with like legacy systems, which is actually, I think it's Eric Evans was one who first, started talking about the autonomous bubble as a means of working with a legacy system. You might have a thing sitting on top of that forwards from one to the other. If you've got a context that you don't want to have actually coupled either by subscription or by something we talked about earlier on, I think before you guys came in, was associations on a schema to an outside context, right? Which is something that's done in the Phoenix guys. This is something I actually disagree with pretty strongly. out of the famous guides, that's not a good idea. All you're doing at that point is creating a coupling between two things that you are, by putting them in separate contexts or expressly saying are not tied together, right? And so it's a convenience that you do in order to kind of like not have to make multiple function calls to gather data. I think it's not a good idea to do that because it's just, you know, chipping away at the boundary that you're trying to create. And something we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, but I think is, I mentioned once earlier though, is like, if you haven't done anything with GraphQL, like I would really recommend checking it out.
Yeah, I just ordered the book. So.
It's really good.
I'm going to do the training at ElixirCon.
Yeah, I think if you haven't done anything with it, it'd be well worth it. I mean,
I just feel like 2 days, it won't be necessarily a toy project because sometimes the one-day training is like, it feels like there's so much time getting up to speed that you don't get real world questions, or like the problem space isn't complex enough to be like, oh, this is how I would actually apply it. You know, you get the same example problem that the guide has of like, well, this is just a blog. That's not a complex enough domain for me to figure out like the problems I'm actually going to have when I try to implement it.
Right. And the thing is, like GraphQL to me is a really great piece of technology for stitching together different contexts. I mean, you can do, using things like batch resolvers, you can, you know, in just 2 or 3 passes, tie together data from different contexts into one cohesive, you know, kind of package for your client. And that both allows you to keep these things nice and separate without having to make like associations across the context boundary, but still have a convenient payload for your clients to use.
Are batch resolvers like an absent thing, or is it something that almost every GraphQL?
It's not a pattern you need to absent. I mean, it's basically just like gather up all of your.
Right, but like the absence stuff supports it to make it easy, right? And not necessarily it's a benefit of using absent in Elixir. It's not necessarily something that would just work. Or is it like a requirement that server implementations of GraphQL support like batching under the covers and the fact that like you can have it fail gracefully?
It's not a part of the spec.
Oh, okay.
If that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
The pattern is pretty simple. It's like,
well, I was just wondering because like you're saying GraphQL does this, but is it more like absence makes this easy?
Yeah, I should be more specific. Absent makes it easy to do this using their support for batch resolvers. Other GraphQL implementations also do this. I don't think it's universal. So you may see, you know, like say the GraphQL implementation in Go that doesn't do things this way, and I have, before anybody jumps on me, I have no idea whether or not it does, because I don't do it.
No, it's just a generic specification and really.
Yeah, and the pattern's fairly straightforward, right? It's take a first pass and get all of your parent objects, and then take all of those IDs and then pass them to something that can fetch, you know, your second level data. Like if I'm getting like user and then blog articles and then under that comments, right? Like I'm going to go first, I'm going to get all my user IDs. I'm going to hand it off to something that can pluck back, you know, all of the articles from those user IDs and put them together in a map format where on the resolution pass, I come back and I just copy out, you know, everything that I look it up by, as a map by user ID, right? And then by the time it makes its way out of absent, that gets put into a nicely nested object that you can use, you know, within your data store or within your client side.
I will say that would be very nice because everywhere else, having to self-batch is a lot of herring reduces.
Yeah, dude, I'm telling you, man.
Because I always end up with a
GraphQL is the shit that REST always dreamed of being. Right?
Like there's so much stuff in your indexer, mostly because the API is like you can set an ID for what this call is, but you can't send like the actual first parameter because it's the wrong format. So like I have all these reduces of like tuple of like one thing is the list of actual requests I want, and one is a map of like this is the ID that goes back to the actual data I care about. And if there's just like a built-in batch system, that actually just handled it, it'd be so much easier. But I'll probably have to write it myself because I mean it's JSON RPC and not GraphQL.
Yeah, I mean,
Although I guess
feel for you, man.
does Absinthe have a really nice like client equivalent to also do batching when you're in another? Oh, but I thought Apollo was like browser client.
Oh yeah, I
not-
mean it is browser client. Sorry, I'm misunderstanding what you're asking.
I meant like, is there an Elixir client that also does batching when you're hitting a remote GraphQL API?
So your remote GraphQL API would do batching for any data coming from that thing.
Well, I'm just saying if you have two GraphQL ones, you'd want to do the same batching system.
I mean, it kind of depends on that remote API, right? If that remote API provides a call that allows you to supply a list of IDs and get back all the documents associated with it, then sure, you can do that. Most probably don't. They expect you to request like a single RESTful resource, right? So, if the GraphQL API is wrapping something internally, it's pretty easy to give yourself that affordance, to let yourself get a list of the blogs based on the user IDs.
Does Absinthe, so I know GraphQL supports like grouping operations together, right? And
yeah, I mean you can.
And so when you group and it turns out to be a bunch of reads, does the batch resolve automatically like group like, oh, these all are the same? Is it endpoint or action? Like the thing that looks like a function call in GraphQL when you're doing a read. Like, does it figure out, oh, those are all the same call, here are all the ID keys, now batch resolve together?
No, so those are called fields, right? Okay. Each thing you're trying to resolve is called a field.
Okay.
And in Absinthe, when you write those, you hand back a tuple that indicates this is batch resolved, right?
Oh, okay.
And so then it takes, Absinthe takes that and it's just a middleware that does this thing. And so they'll, pass it along to the next step of the process, which is, hey, resolve me all of these IDs, right? And then it's going to hand back a map or some data structure, and then you've got another function with the batch resolver that his job is to take whatever came out of the batch resolver and individualize it back into the parent document.
Okay.
Right. And so you went from having a list of, if I'm getting a list of projects, and then for each project, I want to get a list of comments. First I'm going to start by getting all the projects, then take all those IDs, get all of the comments at once, and then copy them into each project and place it goes, right? So you're first of all, it's a hierarchical operation, right? Mm-hmm. So this is something that relational databases don't do super well for the most part.
Right.
Even when you're doing, a preload with Ecto, it's the same process. Mm-hmm. Ecto is going to make 2 SQL requests to preload those associations, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a pattern that we see in many other places, mm-hmm. And it's fairly easy to implement. Absinthe does it for you if you use the batch resolver functionality. But there's not anything particularly hard about doing it yourself. It is just kind of like labor intensive if you have to write it for every single interface, Mm-hmm. But the other thing you can do with Absinthe pretty easily is do async resolvers, right? So if you do have a remote data store, right, and you've got a list of IDs that I know ahead of time, I can at least start resolving those remote documents in parallel.
Oh.
Use the farm, send them out as tasks or however you want to do it, and then you can tell Absinthe, hey, this is async, come back later, and then before it finishes resolving the document, it will come back and collect all of the responses, stitch those in the right kind of thing. So it's a different version of like a batch kind of thing.
How does it handle errors when you have the asyncs? Like, does it automatically capture?
I mean, same way, because ultimately it's a synchronous operation to the client.
Okay, so but like, if you async and some of the tests fail, is it going to error on some, or does it error the whole request because I couldn't get you the whole request?
I think it depends on where the field is in the document, but I think it's going to show don't quote me on this, I think it's going to show error on the field that errored out.
Oh, is the error format part of GraphQL?
I don't know the answer to that anymore. At one point it was not. Like
Okay.
errors were not well specified within this, but like what Absinthe is doing these days for it seems fairly well defined. So I'm wondering if they have not iterated the GraphQL spec and made that more.
Because that's one of the problems with JSON APIs. They define the error objects, but every single field is optional. And so there's no way just hitting a random JSON API to be like, how do I interpret errors? Like you don't necessarily have to, for each individual error, have the like HTTP status code for that error. And so like when I implemented the library, I'm like, well, I'll take the status code from each individual error and find like the closest 100 that makes sense. So if you have like a mix of 500s and 400s, I'll say it's a 500. If you have a bunch of 400s and they're all 422, fine. The overall one is 422 for the status code. But if it's like a bunch of 400s, then you just become 400. And like that's not part of the standard of like how do you machine interpret the errors? Even though like it's a machine readable format, there's no way you just like the thing to the user, but it's also like every field is optional. And so that bugs me about error handling of like, errors are going to happen, but we really don't care how we represent them.
So, and generally, you know, this is something that, I mean, I see it in Absinthe. I don't know if this is a universal thing or not. But you don't tack on a 400 error or something like that. It's, you know, an error in a message.
Okay.
I think you can add additional data to it, to the error, but the field in the document is null, and you know you get back an errors collection that kind of indicates what messages came back for. I think you can actually have more than one error returned for a field, but again, don't quote me on that.
Okay.
So to recap, I think GraphQL is awesome, and you know is definitely the way to like kind of stitch together a lot of different bounding contexts in an efficient way. Any other thoughts, questions? No? Melody, still with us?
Nola, you still there?
I think we bored her.
She's there but muted, so I don't know if
Okay.
she can hear us.
So that's kind of all I, you know, really wanted to talk about. We touched on most of the things that I think are relevant to creating good contexts. You know, the cohesion thing, I don't know if we spent a ton of time talking about that, but I think that's more of a thing I use to kind of figure out, is this context actually makes sense, is whether or not I can detect, you know, a lot of cohesion between the concepts within it, right? Rather than things that are not related, well, you know, to each other.
You know, I tend to learn a lot by reading other people's code. So it's, I guess it would be kind of good to see, helpful to see examples of like complex and simple one uses in context. So I can just kind of browse and
The client I'm currently working for at Docker at POA Networks, their repo is open source, but mind you, there's only one like context that has data in it. The other contexts are related to like indexing, like I was discussing. So it's not going to cover context the way that Keith has described, or the guide describes, where like you potentially have multiple data sources and each one of those has a context or something. But it is open source, as you can see it. So it's POA Networks has a GitHub, you know, organization, and it's called POA Explorer. So you could look at that if you want. I don't know any other open source stuff that has a bunch of context in it.
Conduit is an application that is kind of the example application for Commanded, which is a CQRS event sourcing framework. Elixir is probably the most well-developed one of the options that are out there. And it's an implementation of this platform called Real World, which is a set of interfaces that's very well specified for both the front end and the back end. And so you can go to their website and see like literally dozens of implementations of both the client side and the back end. You kind of compare and contrast them to see like, here's how you would do something like this, right? And so Conduit's a good example, I think, for the use of contexts because, being a CQRS event sourced application, those are kind of like first-class concepts in that space.
Yeah, I'm right now after site and contest and seeing accounts, log, support.
Yeah, maybe a little simplified, but I can.
And then it goes further into it, projectors and events and so on. So
yeah, there's also a book that goes along with that that he's working on by the lead developer on Command that kind of walk you through some of that stuff. And I mean, the nature of this stuff, unfortunately, is that a good, like, kind of fertile ground for analysis is usually a complicated application. And that means somebody wants to make money on it, right? So it doesn't tend to be open source. And it's kind of a catch-22. I'll try to look at some of the projects I've come across in the past and see if I can see one where I think they're doing a good job of it.
It'd be interesting to check. I'm thinking a complicated one is there's that open source like hospital management software. I wonder if they're using context. I can't remember what it's called though. They were at OSCON last year. No, it's not Elixir, but I bet it might use context though because it's such a complicated domain.
That's what I was gonna say. I don't know about that. I've done a lot of medical software. My experience with most of them, especially the open source offerings, is they are badly designed.
Well, I'm mostly just thinking of like an open source thing that has a complex enough domain that someone would actually think I need to use context to control.
Yeah. So what
project.
I would look for, outside of the Elixir community is look at like there's some .NET example applications. If you look through like CQRS PS literature, you'll find references to different example applications. And while the code certainly doesn't translate to Elixir, directly anyway, if it's written in like C# or something like that, obviously it's a different kind of paradigm, but the conceptual boundaries apply, right? So you can kind of start to see how those things might be separated out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You'll see a lot of this stuff, like they put a lot of thought into it in the DDD world. There's things I think are worth taking away from domain-driven design, and things I think that are just kind of Carter culted, kind of stuff about it. It's hard to know where the line is if you haven't been doing that stuff for a long time. But you will see, at very least, you'll see a lot more applications that are, example applications where they put some thought into different contexts that are out there.
So there's not really any is there anything special as far as a language level?
Nope.
No, I mean, we're really just talking about like
Design
practices.
patterns.
Yeah. Yeah, it's code hygiene, it's design practices, it's just part of good software design.
In other languages, like protected or internal, that got enforced at the namespace level would do this, or like the newest version of Java allows you to actually enforce that like which packages can read into you and read out of you, which fields, and those sort of things would enforce at the language level. But at Elixir, no, it is just a design thing that's probably useful for large projects, which is why we can't show you good examples, because no one does large open source projects with complex domains for the most part, unless it's something where they have there's a closed source thing and it's for some domain where they're going to give you grants to work on it and make it open source for a reason. It's just, unfortunately, we're not going to get a lot of good examples from this. At best, we'll get project review sort of talks at the conferences, but we're not going to ever have good code examples of this is how contexts were actually used in a real world project.
I'm curious. You mentioned earlier that most of the time when you're talking to people about boundary context, you say, follow the rules, maintain separations between contexts. But there are some situations where you start breaking those rules. Do you have any examples of when you start breaking rules?
Reporting. That's always the first one that comes to mind. Reporting is necessarily one of those things that kind of is a cross-cutting concern to the point that the difference between OLAP and OLTP databases, I mean, there's whole transformative processes to go from one to the other just so you can facilitate reporting at an enterprise level, right? And so it's the same thing in a well-factored application that sometimes you're going to have things that kind of cut across. One of the things that I do when we start talking about reporting is I try not to talk about reporting in the abstract. Like I'll identify, here are some patterns we can use in different situations, but there is no one size fits all situation, right? And so the first thing I want to do is talk about specific reports. Like, what are the requirements of this report, and what does it need to pull from in order to facilitate, or to deliver the report? The inclination for most people is to jump to the database. Like, I want to write a single SQL query that's going to give me this stuff. And that's certainly an avenue to go. When you need to do it that way, there's patterns for doing that. You can use, public events, recreate, data stores in other contexts. One of my favorites is to use a database view to, wrap tables that belong to different VCs into a single schema that I can use for my reports. You got to be careful about how you do that sometimes, but it's a really underutilized approach, I think, to rely on your database for that. The GraphQL stuff, like I think we're fairly early in the history of GraphQL, but for a lot of reporting needs, that one works really well, especially when you're going from data sources where you may have even hundreds of thousands of rows that come down to just a single row of aggregate data, right? Where you only need the aggregate. It's really not intensive at all to have a few passes of queries run, but build your document and then kind of, on subsequent passes through, go to your reporting VC. Like at your top level, you've got projects, and then underneath that, you've got some reporting artifact that you need to tie together with a project. So every row in your report is a project with, invoices or something like that, right? So you can go out and pull those invoices from a different context. You don't actually have to have any artificial reporting structures around that, So it's a way of sidestepping that question of, does this cross context boundaries? So you can deliver that report without actually having to cross those boundaries, or by allowing that boundary crossing to happen at the GraphQL or the interface layer. You can just as easily do this in a controller method, something like that. But then there's always, there's going to be that report that is just like, it ties together data from like 4 or 5 different sources, and you need the batch process to get to it or whatever, and so you just use different strategies for that. That tends to be probably the most problematic context for keeping it clean, separated out, clean boundaries, all that kind of stuff. And so that's a kind of a special case of that coordination context I mentioned earlier, where it sits at a higher level than your domain services layer, maybe not outside the application boundary, but it does sit at a higher level, and it works with other data stores to do that. So you might have a process manager, what is it, projector and commanded parlance, so it would create data for you, and then your read model then just pulls that data straight out of the table for speed. And so I usually start by saying, like, do it the clean way, stitch stuff together at the GraphQL boundary or whatever. If that's not working for you, like if it's taking too long, data is just not friendly to that, then start looking at other options. And a lot of times, like we start off with one reporting context, but you actually end up having like several reporting contexts. Like your management reports may be different from your administrative reports, which may be different from your user reports. And you have different requirements and security apparatus around each of those things. And so that's, those can get complicated, fairly quickly. But if we take care when we're designing our boundaries, we can usually not pollute the space too much. And when we do have to do that, we keep it all nice and boxed up. So
one that you may not think of as reporting, but could come up, is that if you have like intensive auditing requirements, like not just like this is the last person that updated, but if like you actually have to have read logs for data, then that potentially touches everything. And so that could cross context, just because from like a compliance and like in the industry you're in, you have to know who read the data. And so in that case, it may be crossed, but in that case, it may be that you have so many audit logs that you're going to store it as a true log and not in your primary data store. Like it doesn't make sense to keep an audit log potentially in the database. Like the Rails paper trail way of keeping the YAMLs is kind of a silly way to keep an audit trail.
Oh yeah, it's
like,
terrible.
Like you really probably should just keep a straight up log, and for the edits, do an event store if the auditing is super intensive.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who's got real auditing requirements, I almost always recommend like taking a hard look at event sourcing, and even if you do post hoc events, make them, domain related, because you're right, the structural logging, like Papertrail does, is just not sufficient.
The only way to really hide the details of the auditing is, to have like kind of the token method of like the request ID threads through everything, as opposed to like threading the user and their current role. Is that at some point you like this request ID has all this stuff about the auditing, and we only pass through the request ID, and that kind of makes it opaque, but it's still going to touch everything if you have the sort of thing where auditing is super important.
So another context where things tend to be kind of, it's not exactly cross-cutting, but something you and I were talking about earlier is authorization, right? And so a different strategy there where you have, a concept that, applies to everything, but, is not its own, it's difficult to call it its own context, right? And so, the use of things like policies or something that kind of sits at that level is, and then each context is, can kind of define its own business rules, or more likely that you've got a layer above the stuff that, so your domain contexts are, just doing whatever they do willy-nilly. They expect somebody else to do the vetting of the request before it gets to their door, right? So you've got, kind of a layer that is a security layer around things.
Our authorization layer ended up being, like, that was one of the things that I had Kelsey do, was because we wanted the RPC layer and the API layer to have different authorization rules potentially. And so it ended up being two-sided. One is like, can I do this request at all? Like, is this user allowed to index? Because why would we run the index, get 100 results, and then be like, you can see none of them? But then on the other side, we had the authorization of, can you see specific fields? And so like authorization got mixed in kind of before the view layer. In our case, we did it the view layer because it was easiest, because we were using JAWS serializer to be like, these fields are hidden from the user. And so like the authorization got entangled from the side and all this stuff, just because we needed to both optimize, like, don't do the query if you're not going to get back anything. And okay, you got stuff back, but your view is based on your role or the fact that you are not the owner of the data. And so it ended up cross-cutting everything.
Yeah, I'm going to be a really annoying guy. I'd say GraphQL does that really well. You can add middleware around individual fields and resolvers.
Yeah, that was the annoying thing. Like, JAWS serializer works for JSON API, but it's super annoying to extend well. So like, we just had this pattern of like, this is the callback you override, and here's the code you write to pick out the individual fields to do the auth. Like it was annoying that it wasn't built
it
in.
can be intensive if you're not. There's a lot of boilerplate involved in that stuff, and I usually find that authorization, like from a security standpoint, has to happen after resolution of the query because you don't have any data to check against until you've actually pulled it back, right? And then there's other kinds where you've got to the resolver has to be complicit in that by scoping its query only to the current users.
Yeah, it was rare that we could disqualify a request at the very beginning. Mostly it was like, if you're looking at a profile and you're not that user, we can disqualify the show. And like, certain classes of users can't do an index because they're only, they would be able to see the ones that they're allowed for, but we find that confusing. So we allow them to do show from like the API requesting on the front end, but we don't allow them to index and then find their stuff. From just like a policy perspective, we just thought that was a better way to enforce the rules and allow people to try to like walk the index inefficiently and that sort of stuff.
Right.
Okay, we got about 11 minutes left. Do we have any more questions? Okay, ideas for topics for next month. We meet the third Monday of the month. I'm not sure what day that is for June. Let me look.
I'm not sure. A lot of traveling this summer.
So that will be the 18th of June, which will also work for me. Wouldn't have worked if it was the next week, but that will work for me. Of course, you don't have to come up with the topic now. It'd be nice if we come up with the topic at least a week before the 18th so that other people can show up for it if they're interested. Otherwise, we will do our normal process of open office hours and discussion of what we're working on. If there's any help you need with call for papers for anywhere. I want to say Big Elixir is still open for CFP, which is the one in New Orleans in November-ish, right?
Yeah, I think it's November 7th and 8th.
Yeah. So that one's still open for CFP?
But we want to continue down this road. I'm happy to talk about GraphQL again. I did that presentation was about 18 months ago.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to rehash that, I can do that. I think I'll be here on the 18th.
Other stuff I could do is there's some cool stuff from
property testing stuff.
I haven't used property testing yet with stream data or anything yet though.
Learning.
But with PO Explorer, like we've had really good results using ectotypes, and so I kind of want to talk about like you probably should always be ectotyping. Like I'm all against like forget stringly typed data, ectotypes forever, because like.
Yeah, I had an interesting thing with an ectotype a while back where it was like I was starting off using art, but it ended up being a pain in the ass. But basically just taking like what was a URL, converting it into a set of URLs that formatted URLs that pointed at different sizing of the stuff on Cloudinary.
Mm-hmm.
That was a fun little use of it that made life much simpler.
Yeah.
So.
You play with Rax?
No.
I haven't. I've been wanting to because the author of Cowboy is really obnoxious. And I just am really interested in some of the other web servers that are out there for it.
Yeah. I just see some starter kits and like a great rad that type of situation of bundling of stuff to get you going.
Racks, it might be fun to have a shootout between like, how you would do something with Racks, Cowboy, and Ace. I think is the other big one.
I thought Rax was above the plug layer, not at the Cowboy layer.
Maybe I'm thinking of a different project. But I thought it sat at the HTTP boundary.
Oh, okay.
And it says here interface for HTTP servers, frameworks, and providers. So.
Yeah, I thought it was a comparator for Phoenix.
Maybe a competitor for Plug.
They have product includes Rackstock router, logger, cases.
Yeah, it's Phoenix level then, not server.
I'm trying to better understand like Plug and Cowboy and so on, how all these come together and to make Phoenix so that I kind of hold myself in the whole.
I mean, well, first of all, the standard response you probably heard before is Phoenix. There's not that big. It's just not a lot.
No, it's not. It's just kind of wrapped with all these other.
It has slightly better.
blue.
It has slightly nicer ways of calling render than base Plug does, and then Phoenix channels.
The router is a little bit more elaborate than a Plug router is. That's the other big, difference I know about. I have done maybe 4 Phoenix rendered views in my career, and they were all basically just hard coded, kind of bits of script tags and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the PL Explorer is the first time I'm using EX HTML with Phoenix. Before that, we were using JSON API, so we always used JAWS serialized views. So we never actually hit the template layer in Phoenix.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have that experience, right? Like the era of server rendered views is kind of going.
Well, that's because in the languages we used to work in, that was very slow and did not work well. But
I mean, yeah, like for a really simple app, like it might still make sense to do it in Phoenix, but even then, like if there's any complexity on the client, like I don't really want to do it in Phoenix, fast or not. It's got less to do with speed and more with organization. I just don't like writing injected views. It's personal preference, I guess. But yeah, it might be an interesting if you want to talk. You're welcome to.
Yeah, like
speakers.
If you don't know something, it is perfectly valid to be like, this is a thing no one else knows or no one has really used. I'm going to research it, and you talk about it. Like people do that for conferences all the time. It's conference-driven development. It's fine to do it for a meetup too. It is fine to use us as a practice session for a talk you will give later. Like that's actually encouraged because you need to practice your talks.
That's actually how I make sure I have my talks for conferences.
Yeah.
Get them here first or something. But yeah, you don't have to be particularly adept at the subject area. Like, nobody's going to pound you with questions that are, like super, super technical.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to.
Plus, the benefit of us being a small room is that we'll ask the questions to find the holes in your talk, but before someone who really shouldn't ask the question in front of 500 people raises their hand and asks the question, that question that requires back and forth, like where you're watching the talk and you're like, they should not ask that question on mic. They should have walked up to the front. Like you want to hopefully tune your talk to address that problem, and practicing here is a way that we can do the back and forth of a small room group discussion of the talk and, prepare it for those sort of questions, hopefully.
It's assuming you want the feedback, like their comments.
Yeah, if you don't want feedback, just tell us and we'll shut up.
You just want to, give a talk. Like we're more than happy to have those.
You can also, just present stuff you've been doing. Like you don't have to lecture. We've been leaning more towards these group discussions because they seem to be just more useful than, talking at the group. Also, because we're such a small group, we can do it. Like, if the group ever got super large, it'd be harder to have a group discussion with lots of people. Yeah, and you don't have to make slides. So that's fun.
Yeah, I actually did put some, effort into an outline that I couldn't get to turn into a slideshow. So,
maybe grab 2 elements.
If y'all want to see it, I gave a talk on it here. I have to admit, so I'm pretty skeptical most of the time and stuff like that. And when it first came out, I was like, this is what the train wreck waiting to happen, right? Like this is going to go so wrong. And then I was working on this project a while back, and I spent like 3 months puttering around in my spare time, creating this, green pipeline of data going flow everything, and on a whim, just kind of sort of poke around and grab it. I was like,
shit, I'm gonna build a shitty version of this, you know? And it really did solve like a lot of my problems out of the gate. I just dropped the features that were like less useful. And it was like, boom, done, you know, tied up in a bow and give it to me. And that was before Async 1.0. And, you know, they've revved it several times since then. So it's a really, really good toolkit, really well developed set of code and practices. And there's honestly, like, I'll never do another RESTful service if I got a choice about it. Like, GraphQL is always a better answer than REST. Not because REST has to be shitty, it's because the tooling around REST has never caught up to what the thesis promised. You know?
And
were you gonna say something?
I was just going to say that we have the benefit of that Absinthe is like one of the leaders in the implementations. I mean, they pushed for the subscription. They had a subscription implementation. And as Keith has said, it has a nice features like batching where things that you'd have to do by hand in most other systems is just there waiting for you. So you don't have to write as much, not necessarily boilerplate, but code you write all the time when you end up writing an actual real world business CRUD application.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it gets rid of a lot of the boilerplate of, you know, creating your own persistence, not persistence layer, request layer, right? That yeah, if y'all want to see GraphQL, I'm happy to talk to you about it next time. And maybe I'll follow that up with another event source.
I think we're about to get kicked.
You guys, I'm not kicking you all out. I'm just letting you know when you do head out, because I know you guys know how to leave this place and everything. Just make sure this clicks so that it'll be along.
Okay.
Cool. Yes. You can toss those little fruit tarts that was from a food event earlier. If you don't have to move for those. I'm glad you found the hops and grains, stuff like that. But all right. Peace. Sure.
Night, Nola.
Bye. Thanks for the streaming it.
Mm-hmm. I'll post the recording to the YouTube channel later.
Okay, cool. Bye, guys.